Texas. Well, good evening. It is indeed a great honor and a privilege to be in a room with so many Republicans. You know, Mr. Lanier asked me to come here and talk tonight, but I would think that most of you know about all there is to know about if you're in this party. But he's asked me to tell you my story, and it starts very simply like this. I was born in Kentucky. I was raised in Indiana, and I lived in Illinois. I worked as a hired hand, a surveyor, a postmaster. I was a captain in the Black Hawk Indian War, and I was a legislator for the state of Illinois. I was elected to our state legislature 4 consecutive times. Now, I ran a 5th time, you know, but I was off fighting the Black Hawk Indian War, and when I got back, I didn't really have time to campaign much. But, you know, out of all the folks there in New Salem, Illinois, out of 277 voters, I got the most of any candidate there. And at least my hometown folks like me. It was the only time that I was ever beat by the people, you know. While I was out fighting the Black Hawk Indian War, though, I met a fellow named John Stewart, and you know, he said to Abe, "What are you going to do when you get back to town?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I'm thinking about becoming a blacksmith." He said, "Well, you know," and I knew I wasn't going to get into the legislature. He said, "Well, why don't you take up the law?" And I said, "Well, I don't have any education." He said, "Oh, you don't need no education." He said, "All you got to do is get the books and read the books." I said, "Well, I can't afford the books." And he said, "Well, I've got the books and you can read them." So I read law in his office for about a year and a half. And in 1836, I received a license to practice the law. Now, the only thing I needed to get that license was a signature from 4 licensed attorneys and a sitting judge to sign an affidavit that I was a man of good moral character and had a working knowledge of the law. The first thing I did was remove myself to Springfield, Illinois. Went to work with my first law partner, the fellow that let me borrow his books, John Stewart. But now, ladies, oh, ladies, it was in Springfield, Illinois that I first met, fell in love with, and married a beautiful young Kentucky girl named Mary Todd. Oh, I tell you, I had been worshiping Mary Todd from afar. Now, fellas, you know, back in those days, if you liked a gal but she was too chicken to say anything to her, well, you worshipped her from afar. I worshipped Mary for about 3 months. She didn't even know who I was, but one night they had a party at her sister's house. I greased up my shoes, put on my very best coat, I walked right up to her and I said, "Miss Todd, ma'am, Miss Todd, ma'am, my name is Abraham Lincoln." "Well, golly, ma'am, I'd like to dance with you in the worstest way." So we started to dance. How we danced. I twirled her all over the dance floor. After I stepped on her toes about 25 times, she stopped me. She looked up and she said, "You know, Mr. Lincoln, you're right. You do dance in the worst way." We were married a short time later and we never danced again. Now, life in Springfield was fine. I bought the only home that I would ever own. My law practice grew and I continued to dabble in politics. You know, in 1846, I was elected to the lower house of Congress. Yeah, and the only thing I managed to do in Congress was make an enemy out of President James K. Polk from Tennessee. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is never a good idea for a freshman congressman to call the President of the United States a liar. But I'm sorry, James K. Polk was a liar. He said that Mexico had invaded the United States and that's why we went to war with them. I said, "Then show me. Show me the exact spot where the first drop of American blood was spilled." It wasn't spilled on American soil. It was spilled on Mexican soil. Mexico didn't invade us. We invaded her. Now, why? Well, we wanted all that land she had. President Polk had offered the Mexican government $9 million for their land, but they didn't want to sell it. So he took it. And I was not a candidate for re-election. I went back home and just threw myself into my law practice. You see, ladies and gentlemen, there's one thing that a politician needs to be successful, and that's an issue. See? Well, I had tried to make the Mexican War my issue, but by the time my term in Congress was over, the war was over, so I had no issue. So I just went home and I said, well, my political career's finished. But ladies, in 1850, the first of many tragedies to come to strike the Lincoln home, our second little boy, Edward, he died of a fever 3 days before his 4th birthday. Consumed with grief, I just put all thought of further politics behind me and threw myself into my law practice. But in 1854, I was aroused to politics as never before by the repeal of the Missouri Compromise and the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now that was a new law that, among other things, could make slavery legal in our new states and territories as well as the old. You see, at least before, slavery had been limited mostly to our southern states. Now it looked like it was going to go everywhere. And now, I had an issue, the extension of slavery. So by 1858, having already joined the new fledgling Republican Party, I was running for the United States Senate. I gave my first speech in the State House in Springfield. It went something like this. We are now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. But under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, it is constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached in fact. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I do not believe that this government can permanently endure half slave and half free. Now, I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect that it'll cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind can rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates shall push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in the new states as well as the old, north as well as south. My opponent for the Senate race was Stephen Arnold Douglas. Steve Douglas. Oh, everybody talked about Steve Douglas. Steve Douglas said this, and Steve Douglas said that, and Steve Douglas went over here. Well, guess what? Steve Douglas was this little bitty short, fat-headed, loud-mouthed Democrat. Whoa. And everybody called him the Little Giant. Well, me and the Little Giant participated in a series of 7 debates, and the main topics of these debates, no matter how Mr. Douglas tried to cover it up, it was always about the extension of slavery. Friend Stephen Douglas thought that it was perfectly acceptable for one human being to buy and sell another human being just because the color of their skin was different. Now, quite frankly, I thought that was wrong. Now, I must tell you this. I never was and never will be an abolitionist. But I've always been anti-slavery. I cannot remember a time that I did not think so. Well, Douglas and I had the debate. And when it was over and they counted all the ballots, I lost. But because of all the national attention I received and the newfangled gadget called a telegraph, I was nominated as a Republican candidate for President of the United States. But ladies and gentlemen, long, long before I was ever nominated as president, the clouds of disunion had been forming. Our nation had been facing the threat of secession since before the ink was dry on the Declaration of Independence. President George Washington faced it during the Whiskey Rebellion. And not only was he willing to send troops into Pennsylvania, he said if it was necessary, he would lead the army himself. Andrew Jackson of Tennessee acted just as boldly in 1832 to crush the secession threat. And he too threatened to send federal troops into South Carolina and to hang every secessionist from the highest tree. And yet now, there are those who claim that the latest secession threat is my fault. They say that they will not abide the election of a Republican president. They say if that happens, they'll dissolve the Union. And then they say it will be my fault that the Union's been dissolved. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to know. I want to know what the men of the South are going to do with their half of the Union. Are they going to split the Ohio River down the middle and push their half off a piece? Will they build up this impenetrable wall between us? Will they, once the Union is dissolved, make war upon us and kill us all? Ladies and gentlemen, I believe the men of the South are as brave and gallant as any men that have ever lived. And I know that they can fight nobly in a just cause. But man for man, they are not any better than we are. And there aren't as many of them as there are us. I don't think they'll ever have much of a chance at whipping us. I don't think anything can come from secession but sorrow and grief on both sides. I think the real fear among some of the Southern politicians is that with a Republican administration, the balance of political power in Washington, for which they themselves for more than 50 years had held the majority, will somehow slip away from them. Well, not only was I nominated, on November the 6th, 1860, I was elected in a constitutionally legal election as the 16th President of the United States and the first Republican to ever have that position. But ladies and gentlemen, I was just the President-elect. I would not be the President for 3 more months. I was elected on November the 6th, 1860. On December the 20th of 1860, South Carolina claimed she had already left the Union. She was quickly followed by 6 other southern states. You see, friends, they didn't wait to hear one word I had to say. They didn't wait to see anything that I was going to do. No, they just did what they've been planning on doing for more than 50 years. I left my home in Springfield, headed for Washington, D.C. the day before my birthday, February the 11th, 1861. I was not prepared to make any sort of farewell speech. But when I got to the depot, when I stepped up on the platform of the rail car, when I looked out and saw the faces of so many of my friends, I had to say something. My friends, no one not in my situation can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this party. To this place, to the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I've lived for a quarter of a century. I've passed from young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being who ever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. Well, the train that I was on, it stopped at several large cities before we even got to Washington. Oh, at one stop in the city of Westfield, New York, a little 11-year-old girl named Grace Bedell was brought to the train to meet me. Now, ladies, remember, I didn't always have this beard. When I was running for president, I had a nice, smooth face. My wife didn't like whiskers anyhow. Said it tickled when I kissed her. But I got a letter from this little girl that went something sort of like this, or at least this is what I thought she was trying to say. I thought what she was trying to say was, Mr. Lincoln, my papa says you're running for president. And he showed me your picture, sir. Well, sir, you'll forgive me for saying so, but your face is so long and it's so skinny. Now she didn't say that I was ugly, but the implication was that I was. Now, ladies, I'm sorry, but back in them days, gals couldn't vote, you know, but she claimed that women liked whiskers. And she said if I grow a beard, the wives would tease their husbands to vote for me. She said if she was a boy and she could vote, if I grow a beard, she'd vote for me. Well, they brought her up to the train to meet me. I picked her up and I kissed her right between the eyes. I said, well, Gracie, what do you think of my new whiskers, honey? She looked at me for a little while and finally she said, well, it's a handsome effort. Handsome effort. And ladies and gentlemen, those were some of the last kind things that anyone said to me for nearly 4 long years. As I said, even before I took the oath of office, 7 of our southern states claimed they left the Union. In my first inaugural address, I begged them to change their minds and to come back home, in part by saying to them, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without you yourselves being the aggressor. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy this government. For I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. We are not enemies, but friends, and we mustn't be enemies. Though passions may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. But they wouldn't listen. The truth is, they never intended to listen. And on April the 12th, 1861, the South fired on Fort Sumter. The war had started. As the president, I did everything I could. I called for troops, I blockaded the southern ports, and I began taking other measures necessary to prepare this country for a war to preserve the Union. Now, the first thing they told me was, oh, Mr. President, how can you call for 75,000 volunteers to invade the South without the authorization of Congress? Well, I didn't think a fellow could invade his own country. And South Carolina knew exactly what she was doing when she fired on Fort Sumter. Congress wasn't in session. And I was going to do everything I could to keep this Union as a whole. But friends, my soldiers, they were losing one battle after another early in the war. Thousands and thousands of young boys were dying on battlefields everywhere. And on February the 20th of 1862, Mrs. Lincoln and I, we suffered another very personal loss. Our third little boy, William, our William, he died of typhoid fever. He had just turned 11 years old. It was almost more than I could stand. And his mother, she never got over it. But ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Lincoln and I, we certainly were not the only parents that lost a son. Families both north and south were suffering tremendous losses. Why, on the 6th and 7th of April, near Shiloh Church in Tennessee, 2 days of fighting left a carpet of bloody casualties. There were nearly 10,000 soldiers dead, almost as many missing and wounded. And among the dead at Shiloh was my wife's half-brother, Samuel B. Todd. And ladies, Sam was in the Southern Army. My wife would lose 2 other half-brothers and a brother-in-law, all fighting for the South. The people in the South said my wife was a spy for the North. The people in the North said she was a spy for the South. Ladies, I hope you understand why she had emotional problems. But several months after Shiloh, on September the 17th, 1862, a place called Antietam would forever be known as the bloodiest single day in the history of America. There were nearly 30,000 soldiers killed, wounded, and missing. And my general, George B. McClellan, claimed that we won the battle. We didn't win. At best, it was a draw. But I used it as a victory. And I used it as an excuse to do something I'd been planning for more than a year. On the 22nd day of September, I called the members of my cabinet together and I said, gentlemen, for a long time now, I've given a great deal of thought to the relationship of this war to slavery. Now, you recall several months ago, I read you an order I prepared on that very subject. But because of objections from some of you, that order was never issued. Ever since then, my mind has been very occupied with this subject, So I determined that as soon as the rebel army was driven out of Maryland, that I would issue a proclamation of emancipation. Now, I said nothing to no one, but I made a promise. I made a promise to myself, and I made a promise to my Maker. Well, gentlemen, the rebel army's been driven out. I intend to fulfill that promise. I've called you here this morning to see what I've written. I do not, however, seek your advice or your opinion on this matter. What I have done after careful and prayerful deliberation and meditation. And I can only trust in God that I haven't made a mistake. With that, I pen my name to the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. That document declared that as of January the 1st, 1863, that all persons held as slaves in states that were in rebellion against the Union would be forever free. But ladies and gentlemen, that proclamation, it certainly didn't free all the slaves. You see, we had slaves in what we called our border states: Delaware, Maryland, Missouri. Oh, and in the very state where I was born, in the state of Kentucky, there were more than 250,000 souls in bondage. They had to wait 2 more years for the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution to get their freedom. And if that sounds confusing to you, put yourself in the place of one of those Kentucky slaves, or better yet, a Tennessee slave. You see, it didn't free any slaves in Tennessee either, but they'd all heard about it. They'd all heard about it. They were ready to cast their chains off and celebrate, only to have someone come up and say, "Oh, no, you see, it's those slaves down there. They're free, not you." But ladies and gentlemen, if that proclamation didn't do anything else, it spelled the beginning of the end for the war. It made it possible for nearly 200,000 black men to join my army. In the remainder of the war, those black men would participate in more than 449 separate engagements. Somewhere between 40 and 60,000 black men died wearing a blue uniform. And 24 of those brave black soldiers and sailors received our nation's highest award, the Congressional Medal of Honor. And you know, friends, the men that received that honor, most of them didn't get it for what they did with a weapon. No, most of them got it for protecting that flag. Now, I ask myself again and again, what would make a black man throw down his rifle, the only thing he had to protect himself with, and pick up a flag that at that moment was still denying him equality? I don't know why they did it, but I thank God every day that they did. Make no mistake, if we hadn't had the help of those black soldiers, I think the war could have gone on indefinitely. Sadly, even with their help, it went on. You know, I signed that proclamation on January the 1st, 1863. By March of 1863, it was apparent not only to myself, but to an awful lot of other people, that if this nation was going to be saved, it was going to require some sort of divine intervention. So on March 30th, 1863, I signed another proclamation. This one was calling for a national day of fasting and prayer. And this is what it said: "It is the duty of nations as well as of men owe their dependence upon the overruling power of God, to confess their sins and transgressions in humble sorrow, with assured hope that genuine repentance will lead to mercy and pardon, and to recognize the sublime truth announced in Holy Scriptures and proven by all history, that those nations only are blessed whose God is the Lord. And insomuch as we know that nations, like individuals, are subjected to punishments and chastisements in this world, may we not justly fear that the terrible calamity which now desolates our great land is but a punishment inflicted upon us for the presumption of our national sins. We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand that preserved us in peace, multiplied, enriched, and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our own hearts that all of these many blessings were produced by some superior wisdom, virtue of our own, intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of a redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us. It behooves us then to humble ourselves before the offended power, to pray for clemency and forgiveness. And when this is done in sincerity and truth, let us rest in a hope authorized in divine teachings that the united cry of the nation will be heard on high and answered with blessings no less than the pardon of our national sins and the restoration of our now suffering and divided country to its normal happy condition of unity and peace. And yet, the war went on, and it got worse. On the first 3 days of July in 1863, in and around a small little Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg, was fought the bloodiest battle ever to take place on the North American continent. More than 50,000 American lives vanished into the mist and smoke and flame of a human storm. Several months later, I myself was in that little town of Gettysburg. I'd been invited by the governor of Pennsylvania to make a very short dedication at the cemetery where some of my soldiers were buried. Now understand, friends, most of the politicians, including my own party, didn't want me to come to Gettysburg. Oh, they were terrified I would say something that would embarrass the country. They waited almost to the last minute to send my invitation in hopes that I wouldn't come. I fooled them when I came in. But I wasn't the main speaker. No, they made sure another man got that honor. His name was Edward Everett. Ladies and gentlemen, Edward Everett was the most famous speaker in America. He stood on the platform that morning. He talked to the people for more than 2 hours. It was a terrific speech. Tell me what he said, Wayne. You know, friends, my mama told me when I was a little boy, she said, son, people are going to remember you not for how much you say, but what you say. Everett spoke for 2 hours. I spoke a little less than 3 minutes. My entire speech has only 10 sentences in it. 272 words. And if there are any teachers out there among you, only 18 of those words have more than 3 syllables. It's a very plain and simple speech. And even though I thought it was a complete failure, some people said that it was remembered. This is what I said on that cold November afternoon. I said, 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot habit this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggle here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little know, nor long remember what we say here. But it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It's rather that we be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. That from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. And that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And yet, the war went on, and it got worse. In March of 1864, I stopped listening to my military advisors, and I promoted Ulysses S. Grant to the rank of Lieutenant General. He was the first man to have that position since George Washington. I asked him one question. I said, "General, tell me you've got a plan to end it." He looked at me and he said, "Yes, Mr. President, I do. It's very simple." Simple. Man, we've been killing each other wholesale for over 2 years, and now you tell me it's simple? Yes, sir, Mr. President. It's mathematics. It has always been mathematics. There are more of us than there are them. We're not exchanging prisoners anymore because the South refuses to exchange black prisoners. They can't replace their losses. Ladies and gentlemen, people thought the war was bad before. When Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan took over, they taught the entire planet what true warfare was all about. At Cold Harbor, Ulysses S. Grant lost 7,000 men in 20 minutes. He sent 7,000 more right behind him. Even my wife called him a butcher. But look at the results. I gave him the army in March of 64. By March of 65, it was almost over. Oh, and I had decided to run as a second term. Now, I have to tell you, I hope this doesn't hurt your feelings, but I didn't run on the Republican ticket. Well, now you got to wait now, see. Now, first of all, I got to tell you, folks, I was a Whig for 22 years, and I'd still be a Whig today if they hadn't wigged out, you know. But you see, there was a group of radical Republicans that what they saw the war was ending, and what they wanted was the fruits of victory. To the conqueror go the prizes. I decided to run for a second term. Against the wishes of a lot of my people, we decided to run on the Union Party. Oh, and I had to choose a new vice president, and so they had a little convention, you know. They came up with several people, and one of them was the governor of Tennessee, Andrew Johnson. He'd been the war governor. Oh, by the way, he was a Democrat, too. Now, Johnson was not my choice, but I thought, well, it's a pretty good idea. You know, maybe it'll help bring the country together. But in August, I called my cabinet together. I took a little piece of paper out of my pocket and I laid it on the table. I said, "Gentlemen, I put an inscription on this page. What I'm going to ask you now is for all of you to sign it, sight unseen, and give me your word that you will abide what I've written down." To my surprise, they all signed it. And it didn't look like I was going to be reelected. See, ladies, public opinion is everything. With it, you can do anything. Without it, you can do nothing. My public opinion was almost at the bottom. But you see, then Sherman took Atlanta. And public opinion changed. And, well, when the vote was over, I was elected to a second term in office, the first man since Andrew Jackson to do that. And then my cabinet said, "What did we sign?" So I took it out, and it said, "Executive Mansion, Washington, August 23, 1864. This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the President-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such grounds that it cannot possibly be saved afterwards." See, George B. McClellan, had he won, I don't think he ever had a chance of winning me, but had he won, he was willing to give the South just about anything they wanted. But I was reelected. And in March of 1865, I gave my second inaugural address, which, by the way, is still the shortest inaugural address of any man before or after me. Now, some of the newspapers the next day wrote stories like, poor President Lincoln. When did he become a minister? Why does he feel it is necessary to deliver a sermon to the nation rather than an inaugural address? You'll have to be the choice, friends. This is what I said on that March morning. I said, my countrymen, on the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. Both sides deprecated war. Yet one side would make war rather than see the Union preserved, and the other side would accept war rather than see the Union perish, and the war came. Both sides read the same Bible. Both sides prayed to the same God, and each invoked his aid against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered, and the prayers of neither have been answered fully. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it should continue, until all the wealth piled up by the bondsmen, 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, till every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be repaid by another drawn by the sword, as it was said 3,000 years ago. So still must it be said today, that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity to all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work that we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, April the 9th, 1865, after nearly 700,000 Americans had died. That was always the saddest part about it. They weren't all Southerners. They weren't all Northerners. They were all Americans. But Robert E. Lee and his army surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, and for all intent and purposes, the war was over. But now, ladies and gentlemen, as the president, I had another terribly difficult job to perform. You see, now, I had to rebuild a nation that had been torn in two and shattered to pieces. But it was a job I would never finish. You two young men, come up here with me. And you two young boys back there, come up here. Come on. Don't be bad. Stand right there. Won't you talk to me? Get over here. No, it was a job that I would never get to finish. Just 5 days after General Lee surrendered, just 5 days after everyone prayed that it was the end of the war, on Good Friday, April the 14th, 1865, my wife Mary and I went to Ford's Theater in Washington to attend a play entitled Our American Cousin. About halfway through that play, just as I had reached to take my wife by the hand, an angry young man named John Wilkes Booth pointed a small gun just behind my left ear, and he fired one bullet. And I became the first American president to be assassinated. And I was only 56 years old. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I just told you the whole story of my life from the day I was born till the day I died, but more than anything else, I just told you the story of my war, that terrible Civil War. But now I need to talk to you about a different kind of war that these 4 young men back here are fighting every single day. They're fighting wars against hunger, poverty, and racism. They're fighting wars against crime, drugs, and violence. They're fighting wars against diseases. Friends, my war and every war since then has been fought, won, and lost with too many guns, too much blood, and way too many human lives. I promise you, the wars that these young men are fighting can only truly be won with two things: a loving and merciful God and knowledge. And that knowledge right now is locked up deep inside one of their young minds. And to unlock it, they need a special key. And that key is that education. So what's your name?
My name is Blake Lehman.
Now you see Blake right here. Are you in college?
No, I'm going to be a senior next
Yeah.
year.
Where are you going to college?
Mizzou.
Mizzou. Well, guess what? Yeah. If he'll stay in school and study real hard, he could someday find a way to end world hunger, poverty, and racism. Thank you so much. What? No, you come here. What's your name? Zane. All right. Where are you from?
King County, from Missouri.
Ah, Missouri. Show me. Yeah. Guess what? If this young man will stay in school and study real hard, he could someday find a way to end these wars against crime, drugs, and violence. Step back there. Now, see, you look nice as students. Come up here. What's your name?
Peyton.
Hey, like the guy with. Listen very carefully, friends. If this young man right here will stay in school and study real hard, he could be the one person on this planet to find a cure for cancer, AIDS, leukemia, diabetes, just to name a few. Thank you, son. And I say the best for last. What's your name?
My name is Clayton.
Clayton. Ladies and gentlemen, if Clayton will stay in school and study real hard, there's not a power on this earth that can stop that young man from growing up and being the President of the United States. But you see, friends, here's the truth. And listen carefully. In their lifetime, there is going to be a woman president.
Yep.
I didn't say what party she was in. I said she's going to be a woman. You know, it's quite possible that in their lifetime there will be an Asian president. It's also quite possible in their lifetime there might be a Hispanic president. And you know what? If we're all really, really lucky, we might just have a Republican Native American president. So you see, as much as I enjoy standing in a room full of politicians and making speeches, that's not why I came here. I fooled my boss man here, see? He thought I was going to come out here and talk about nothing but politics. No, I came out here to beg every one of you people to keep up the work that you are doing, to encourage the children in this world to get a proper education. If a child is not afraid to get a job in this country, they can get all the education they want. So encourage them to educate themselves with their own hard work, with the dedication of their teachers, and with the help of you, their parents and grandparents. Then encourage today's children to go out there in that world and do something good to help their fellow man become everything that they can be. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand up here this evening. I represent nothing more than an image and a voice from the past. These young men, these young people in our country, they are the voices of tomorrow. And it's into their young and your capable hands that I leave the future of the entire planet. And with that, I bid each and every one of you an affectionate farewell. Thank you. Now, I'm going to give these young men a big hand, too. And now, I'm going to turn the podium over to the real politicians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Very good.